Welcome back to part two. Okay then, so the social conservatives. So, some key features about this group. So, firstly, what's their main ideas? Well, they grew as a force really in the 1970s in response to the sexual liberation of the 1960s, in response to Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court decision of 1972, I think it was, 73, so around there. Also, things like the equal think about the equal amendments thing, for women being seen as equal to men, all of that type of stuff. And they've got very strong moral values. They believe that, obviously, as like conservatives, that humans are basically nasty people, aren't we? We need strong moral values in order to ensure that people remain on the straight and narrow, so to speak. Strongly oppose abortion, want to protect the home from immoral influences, so many of them have supported in the past parental chips on TV. This idea you can buy something on your TV so you can filter out so your kids can't watch certain TV shows or channels. Some of them want to reverse this Supreme Court decision of 1962, Engel versus Vitale, which said that school prayer was actually unconstitutional. And many of them want to reverse Oberville versus Hodges. This is the decision that allowed gay marriage. But the big issue for this group tends to be Roe versus Wade, this abortion. They see it as murder abortions, basically. Now, the strength within the Republican Party, Republicans often appoint social conservatives onto the federal court, Supreme Court and lower courts, and we saw that, didn't we, a week or two ago with the appointment of the new Supreme Court Justice onto the Supreme Court, who is very much a social conservative, Amy Coney Barrett. The Republicans get a great deal of their support as well from the evangelicals. Usually over 80% of evangelicals, Christians, and they make up about 20% of the American population, something like that. People who go to church, more than once a week, those sorts of groups, they overwhelmingly support the Republican Party. Vice President Mike Pence is definitely of this group. He's a very strong social conservative. And Republican supporters, as I said before, tend to identify, many evangelicals, identify with the Republican Party. Some examples of people from this one. This person is no longer in the US House of Representatives, but he's the former Speaker from 2010 to 2015, a man called John Boehner. He stated when he was Speaker that his highest priority in Congress was to pass a no taxpayer funding for abortion act. He actually failed to do that, but that shows you where his direction was. This other character is a social conservative, Senator Tom Coburn of Oklahoma. Oklahoma is one of the most conservative states in the United States. He's actually supported and sponsored numerous bills in Congress to limit abortion rights. In 1996, he sponsored the Defense of Marriage Act, which prevented the federal government from recognising same-sex marriage. So, a very strong social conservative. Okay, the final grouping within Congress is the so-called Freedom Caucus. They are made up of more extreme socials, extreme fiscals, more of the fiscals, I would say, than the socials, and libertarians as well. And they tend to believe in things like smaller governments. So, the ideas of this group came from a group called the Tea Party movement. They were a bunch of fairly radical Republicans who believed that the Republican Party under George W. Bush had moved too much in a moderate direction. It wasn't really conservative anymore. George Bush was quite socially conservative, but they felt that fiscally conservative he wasn't. He wanted he supported things like immigration reform, which they didn't like. He supported a stimulus package following the financial crash. They thought that was just big government intervening in the economy. They also reacted to the Obama presidency as well. Things like Obamacare, they were very much against. They thought Obama was too much of a socialist. So the Tea Party movement have become the basis of the Freedom Caucus. And you're going to watch a video after this about the Tea Party movement. It was done in 2010, but it is a really good video. As I said before, they're a mix of the more radical fiscals, some social conservatives and libertarians. Many are very ideological, unwilling to compromise, and you find in Congress that they No, they just will not do things which Democrats want to do. They won't kind of discuss or compromise on any kind of issues. Again, before the 2020 election, 33 House members identified as this group, one of which was Mr. Meadows, who now is Donald Trump, or was anyway to the election, Donald Trump's chief of staff. So again, that might tell you something about Donald Trump. They contributed very much to the downfall of the former speaker we saw before, John Boehner. They made his life hell, basically, and they orchestrated his kind of fall from power. They did unseat a number of moderate Republicans as well, which we'll come to in a few moments. And I've put Trump question mark because I would argue that in many respects Donald Trump is a Tea Party kind of idealist, especially in terms of the economy. Not really a social conservative is our friend Mr. Trump. I think he's got quite strong Tea Party leanings, I would argue. That kind of populism, I would suggest. Okay, ignore the bottom bit for now. I meant to do those animations. These are some Tea Party victims. So these are some moderate Republicans who were taken out by the Tea Party during the primaries. One of this guy on the Richard Murdoch, for example, he's the guy on the left. He unseated Richard Lugar. Richard Lugar, Indiana, very strong conservative state. He'd been a senator, Richard Lugar, in Indiana since the 1970s. He committed the crime of supporting Democrats on some issues during his time in office. He was known for being fairly bipartisan. One of those 1970s kind of, he was quite conservative, to be fair, but he was quite, genial and quite nice, I suppose is the phrase. He was replaced by Richard Murdoch in the primaries because, a bit like with Trump, the primary people, the people who voted in the primaries, he used that populist message to get them to vote, and they were more committed to voting than many more moderate Republicans in the primaries. It's a problem with primaries very often. In the election itself, Murdoch said that life, even if it came from rape, was a gift from God. And this was seen as too much, even for many Republican voters in Indiana. And in 2012, he actually lost the seat for the Republicans, and the Democrats won that seat. Eric Cantor on the right, this person represents my sister's, or did do any of my sister's seat in Virginia, the 7th District of Virginia. Eric Cantor on the right was a very strong fiscal conservative. I think it was some kind of storm hit Virginia, and he didn't even ask for federal money to help rebuild Virginia. He said, he was sticking by his beliefs. So very strong fiscal conservative, part of the leadership team for the Republicans as well. However, he was not seen as being conservative enough by many Tea Party people, and this guy called Dave Bratt, great name, actually was a Tea Party person, and he unseats him in the primaries. Brett actually went on to win the general election, and he was a member of the Freedom Caucus as well. However, in the 28 midterms, he lost his seat to the Democrats. Now, also floating around the Republicans are two other groups as well. You have the Libertarians, who we have mentioned before, who tend to be on the more right-hand side. They're quite a small but noisy group, I would say, within the Republican Party. They want to abolish most of the federal government, and again, many of the Tea Party are kind of libertarians, I would argue. Ron Paul, who is Senator Rand Paul's daddy, who we met before, he's actually stood as an independent libertarian candidate a number of times. He's now got old and doesn't do it anymore. And Rand Paul as well has some of these tendencies. And the other group who seem to have disappeared in recent times, again, are these neoconservatives. And they tend to be the most hawkish members in terms of foreign policy, the most aggressive in terms of foreign policy. Usually they're scattered around the other factions as well. So, for example, Dick Cheney, who was George Bush's vice president, okay, I would very much put him as a neoconservative. I'd also put Dick Cheney as a social conservative and a fiscal conservative as well. Former President George W. Bush, again, thinking about the Iraq War and stuff, I would put him in this category as well. He's seen particularly as a social conservative. And then John McCain, I should really remove now, he's now dead, isn't he? But he actually is often seen as being more moderate end of the Republican Party. But again, he was quite aggressive in terms of foreign policy. And even, when Obama was president, he was saying that, they should put more troops into Iraq and all the rest of it. Okay, so the final bit is looking at similarities and differences in factions between the Republicans and the UK Conservative Party. Okay, I put US Conservative Party, I meant UK Conservative Party. Because again, it is a comparative area, this bit. So we need to make this looking at these similarities and differences between the two. So, very quickly, just a reminder of UK factions in the Conservatives. Europe is the big issue, isn't it, in the UK Conservative Party, which really splits off the Conservatives. You've got the European Research Group, which is almost a party within a party. They've got their own whips in this group. They have their own meetings. Again, very much like a caucusing in the US Congress, very similar to the American model. They're very strong Brexiteers. And then you've got the pro-Europeans in the UK Conservative Party, many of whom actually lost their seats or they were turfed out, whether by Boris Johnson, if you remember, just before the general election in 2019. So they're basically virtually dead, that group. And then you've got these other factions, haven't you, in the Conservative Party? You've got these One Nation Conservatives, for example, who are kind of your more pro-European types. There are some of these still in the Conservatives. And then you've got your more Thatcherite kind of members of the Conservative Party. I would argue under Boris that actually these pro-Europeans, One Nation Conservatives, are actually much smaller factions compared to the European Research Group. Though I'm not quite sure where some of those new Northern Conservative MPs sit on all this. In terms of similarities and differences, thinking about those potential exam questions, well, one obvious similarity about the factions in both parties is that they both have them. They both have members who are more radical than their establishment. So, for example, the Tea Party are quite strong, Donald Trump supporters are quite strong, as was shown by the primaries in 2016 and 2020, and the fact the Tea Party took out moderates in those primaries. And again, I would suggest that's also true within the Conservative Party as well, that the membership tend to be more radical than the MPs. Think about how many pro-European MPs there were under Theresa May, and how the membership, when they had the chance, they voted for the much more radical Boris Johnson to be their leader. So I would say the membership of both parties is more radical than their establishment. The Freedom Caucus in the United States is essentially a party within a party, and I would argue the European Research Group is the very same way, in terms of structure, not in terms of beliefs, but in terms of structure. And then some representatives of both sides have been threatened with deselection, haven't they? So the Tea Party have taken out moderate Republicans in primaries, and we saw Boris Johnson basically removed a lot of moderate Conservatives from his own party, didn't he, just before the 2019 election, and they were replaced by more radical Brexiteers in that election. In terms of differences, most factions within the Republican Party are more organised, I would say, than in the Conservative Party. Yes, you've got the research group, but the other groupings in the Conservatives are not that well organised. And the factions within the Conservative Party have mainly over one issue, Europe, whereas in the Republican Party it's much more kind of fundamental. You don't have these divisions in the UK Conservatives over things like social policy. Most Conservatives, for example, support abortion and gay marriage, and there's not any particular factions, as far as I'm aware, which are particularly on that particular issue. Okay, so I hope that's been of some use to you, and I'll see you for your next video.